The convener of Sydney Ideas, Meredith Hall, and I have been talking for quite a number of years now about putting a panel together such as this. And our talk finally became a reality recently when a number of prominent feminists had agreed to come to Sydney to attend a workshop on the question of gender and political institutions that I'm co-convening this week with Fiona Mackay from the University of Edinburgh and Georgina Whalen from Sheffield University. And we are very fortunate tonight to have together on one panel some of the leading academics and commentators from the US, the UK, and here in Australia in the area of gender and politics. So let me introduce each of them to you. From the United States, we have Professors Mary Katzenstein and Karen Beckwith. Karen Beckwith is the Flora Stone Mather Professor of Political Science at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. And her most recent book, Political Women and American Democracy, examines women as citizens, voters, activists, candidates and legislators in the US political system. Mary Katzenstein is the Stephen and Evelyn Millman Professor of American Studies and Professor of Government at Cornell University. Mary's written extensively about political activism and social movements in the US, Europe and South Asia. And her wonderful book, Faithful and Fearless, won the American Political Science Association's Victoria Shuck Award for the best book in gender and politics. From the United Kingdom, we welcome Fiona Mackay, who is a senior lecturer in politics and the director of the Graduate School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. Her recent books include Women, Politics and Constitutional Change and a forthcoming book on gender, politics and institutions. Fiona's been active in the 50-50 campaign for gender parity in political and public life in the run-up to devolution in the UK and is a close watcher of the forthcoming British election. From Australia, we have Sue Goodwin, who is a senior lecturer here at Sydney University in policy studies in the Faculty of Education and Social Work. Sue's written extensively about women's participation in public policy in Australia, and her forthcoming book, The Good Mother, explores representations of mothers in contemporary Australian social and political contexts. Sue currently holds a Thompson Fellowship at the University of Sydney in recognition of her important scholarship. Our last panellist tonight is an alumni of Sydney University, Dr. Rebecca Huntley, who's a writer and a social researcher of the University of Sydney, where she gained a PhD on the topic of women and ALP politics. She's the director of the Ipsos Mackay Report, Australia's longest-running social trends report, and the author of Eating Between the Lines and The World According to Why. Our forum's chair tonight is someone that's probably well known to many of us, Lisa Forrest. Lisa is well known as being a former Olympic swimmer, but also for having an extensive career as a TV and radio broadcaster, also an actor and writer. Her most recent book, Boycott, was published by ABC Books. So before I just hand over to the panel, I'd just like to thank a number of different organisations and people who have made tonight's event possible. Firstly to the University of Sydney, especially the Faculty of Arts and the International Program Development Fund, the United States Studies Centre, which has supported the visits of both our American visitors, the Faculty of Arts at the University of New South Wales, the British Academy and the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, as well as the Universities of Edinburgh and Sheffield. So thanks to you all for coming and enjoy the discussion. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for being here. Thanks, Louise. We will be speaking, or be having a chat for about 45 minutes. We've been in the green room beforehand, and I didn't get many questions in, so I'm pretty sure that the discussion will be it was a fabulous one in the green room, so it'll be even better out here tonight. We're warmed up. We had to wake up our American guests who've flown a long way, so we thank them very much for coming with us tonight, for being here tonight. We've got 45 minutes to chat. and then we'll open the discussion up to you, and we'll have about 30 minutes to ask questions. There are 2 microphones here, which we can barely see, but we're hoping when you're standing behind them we'll see you easily. And we ask you to come down to the microphone when you want to ask a question. So welcome, ladies. Thank you very much for coming. I was saying to everyone outside, my introduction to feminism was 1975. I was 10. It was the International Year of Women was coming up. The excitement of that event and that moment, the hopes that we had, the responsibility, I suppose, as a young girl, as being the first generation, and guess what we now call the second wave, was sort of there. We could feel it all. But I mostly remember the song, Helen Reddy's I Am Woman. And I remember it because my mother used to play it very loudly while she was doing the vacuuming. Now, we've come a long way since then, of course, but tonight we'll be discussing how we've come a long way, whether there are some places that we've gained more, lost less, lost more. We'll see what happens as we come out of the discussion tonight. As a way of starting, I thought I might just put it to our panel to give their views on where they think feminism is at the moment in their country and what role it has in shaping the political agenda. And we'll start, Karen Beckwith, with you. Hello.
Well, thank you so much. Hello, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And I do want to thank Sydney Ideas and the University of Sydney, and especially Louise Chappelle. It's lovely to be here. This is my first time, so I'm very excited and very happy to be here. So thank you all. So let me just say that where feminism is in the United States, I think it's much healthier than might be appreciated, and I think there's a lot that is under what the media might see. So let me just say that there are 4 ways in which I think feminism matters and is fairly strong. The first is symbolically. So the political science research indicates that where there are women in office, women in those states evidence in increased levels of information about politics, increased levels of interest in politics. And so there's a lifting element that has to do just with that symbolism. There are lots of different ways we might think about the symbolism of women in politics and what feminism might do. So it has mattered in terms of establishing a very important symbolic base. Secondly, it seems to matter in terms of public policy. And there's some, the literature is not completely conclusive on this in the US, but at the state legislative level, there does seem to be some evidence that the more women there are in the state legislature, the more women-friendly the legislation is in terms of what states might do in terms of child care provisions, health policies within the state, educational policies, the institution of full-day kindergarten, things like this. It also, it seems to me, matters, and again, this has to do with feminism and not just women in politics, but feminism, it seems to me, has raised issues of women's presence in powerful institutions that has to do with legitimacy issues. One of the things I think feminism has done in the United States is it has raised the question of why are there not more women? And it's raised it in many different venues, and I think that's been a really important contribution that we shouldn't take for granted. And then the fourth is in terms of discourse, and in many ways this might be on the face of it the weakest, but one of the things that we do see in the United States, elected members of Congress, men and women speaking in gender inclusive language, so talking about men and women, and this is for my daughter who's almost 22 now, this is commonplace, this has been her lifetime, but this is a big change to always use language in a way that expresses the presence of women. And so the lack of invisibility of women at the legislative level, in private corporations, in the university, this is a major contribution. So those are sort of the 4 ways in terms of symbolic, in terms of policy, in terms of legitimacy, and in terms of discourse.
Mary Katzenstein, would you agree?
Yes.
Thank you.
I always agree with Karen. Let me just join Karen in saying thank you to Sydney Ideas. This is exciting because you can get very introspective and inward-looking in the United States. And so it's really wonderful to be here and hear about feminism in other country contexts. And, you know, we spend our day saying we'd like some of that because there's a lot that happens elsewhere that's not happening in the United States. And that's sort of my theme. So maybe let me make 3 points about the bad, the good/bad, depending on your perspective, and the good. So let me start with the bad, which is that America is probably aptly described as, and this would be true for gender and politics, as American exceptionalism. So what does that mean in the context of gender and politics? What it means is that the market rules. So what do we have? I mean, we have very little in the way of public policies that support the family, that support gender equality at the national level. We don't have paid parental leave. We have very little in the way of childcare. We have very little federal support for reproductive rights. So the rule in the context of gender and politics in the United States is the market rules, and if you want it and can pay for it, you got it. So that's the bad, and that's seriously bad. The good/bad, depending on where you sit or what your perspective is that we do support a lot of policies that are concerned with women victims of violence. And yet, the way in which we do that is to support very punitive responses. So we criminalize the abuser in many ways, and we criminalize the father who doesn't pay child support. And that may be, at least in my perspective, sometimes very counterproductive. But in some respects it's good, in some respects it's not good. What's the good? I will get there. I think, well, for one thing, Sarah Palin is not one heartbeat away from the presidency. The good, to be very personal about it, is that when I graduated from college, which is about the time that you were born, there were 2 women in the Senate and 2 women in the Senate and 12 women in the House. Now those 2 women have turned into 17, and the 12 women in the House have turned into 73. So that feels like, I don't know the names of everybody in the U.S. House of Representatives. That does feel like progress. And I guess the point on which I would end is that despite all of this, despite the problems, feminism is still very active in the United States. And I think it's mostly active in the locales in which people live. It's active in place. So there are a lot of active associations, for instance, in the church, the Catholic Church, which I spent some time studying, in the U.S. military, in the nonprofit sector, in the arts, in orchestras. I mean, just everywhere you look in the workplace, there's some kind of activism aimed at making things better for women in those situations. And just to end with one quick example, we've been having this healthcare debate, and women religious in the United States weighed in on this healthcare debate. So the 55,000 women represented by certain peak associations said that they thought the healthcare debate, which covered abortion, was good for women, especially for low-income women. So there was one crucial vote that involved a Democrat from Stupak from Michigan, and he said he was weighing whether he should vote with the Democrats for healthcare or not, and he said he was not inclined to vote for this healthcare bill. He certainly wasn't going to listen to the nuns. He was going to listen to the men in the church because they could speak with authority. Well, ultimately, he just today voted for the healthcare bill. And there was a column in the Washington Post by Maureen Dowd in which she said, these days particularly, if you had to choose between the priests and the papacy on the one hand, or women religious on the other hand, I'd go with the gals. So, I think there's real power in feminism these days in the United States.
Fiona Mackay, we'll leave the Aussies for a moment and we'll go to the UK. What's happening with feminism there?
Again, to echo my thanks to Sydney Ideas. This is a sort of a wonderful opportunity to share some experiences. My comments are going to be shorter and more informal at this stage. And I suppose I would say that the signs are very mixed in the UK about where feminism is. There is an apparent resurgence of feminism, but I don't know whether that's just that stuff's getting above the radar again. So there are a lot of books have just come out very recently looking at the state of women's equality, looking at women's lives and so on. And there's a lot of activity going on, young women on the blogosphere. So there's a lot of cyber activity going on, which again would suggest that there are green shoots and so on. And we've seen, for example, things like really veteran organisations like the Fawcett Society, which is one of the original suffrage societies. Its membership has gone up 25% in the last 12 months, and its newsletter has increased its subscribers by about fourfold. So all of that is going on. We've got a general election which, unless I've missed something, still hasn't quite been called, but has to take place before, I think it's May the 6th, so it is imminent. And women's representation for the first time is a sort of an accepted good across the board. So actually all the political parties are talking about women's representation as a goal and are fielding probably more candidates in winnable seats than they have done before, particularly the Conservative Party, who have traditionally been real laggards in this respect. You know, they've had a woman Prime Minister, a woman leader of the party, but have not been engaged in encouraging women. So if you like, women's representation is seen as good across the board. So that's, again, a kind of positive sign. On the other hand, the other kind of great feature of the general election this time round is that the wives have been called out. So, in fact, most of the media attention at the moment is Gordon Brown's wife, Sarah, versus David Cameron's wife, who's been nicknamed Sam Cam, who has just entered into the fray.
What kind of verses? Are they kind of jelly wrestling?
Well, I'm sure...
This is hopefully not our cue to jelly wrestle.
Heresy there. So basically both of them being used to to humanise, perhaps also to feminise their partners. So I think we've got a lot of mixed...
Which is old-fashioned, really, is it?
Well, it's something we haven't seen before. I think it's quite, we might talk about this later, it's quite kind of presidential, sort of, they're sort of moving into the role of sort of first ladies and first ladies-elect. Both very high-powered professional women. And it may be, and I may ask this, the Michelle Obama effect, which I think is quite a mixed blessing as well.
Well, we'll get to politics specifically and First Ladies in just a moment, but I should ask who wants to go first of our Australian Sue Goodwin. Where are we, would you say, when it comes to feminism in Australia at the moment?
We still have very strong gender divisions and we still have areas of gender ordering. So, for example, in relation to gender divisions, Australia has one of the most gender-segregated workforces of all the OECD countries. So women tend to work with women and men tend to work with men. So if we're thinking about women in politics, or we're thinking about politics generally, I think we need to ask a question about how degendered has politics become. How much is politics something that both men and women do? And for me, this is a very important question around what choices males and females have. In research on areas like nursing and social work, what we've found is over the last 10 years, they've become more feminized and masculine occupations have actually become more masculinized. So, young people in our research, young women will say things like, oh, my parents were really happy that I became a social worker or I did social work, but they wouldn't have been happy if my brother did, because you don't get paid enough. Now, why aren't they thinking that? So feminism has been very important in the area of choice, I think, and even in our research we found both men and women who have been exposed to feminism really pick apart those very naturalized assumptions about what women are and what men are, and they're able to challenge some of those fixed ideas. And I think this is important because it gives them more choice about what they end up doing, and hopefully give people choices around whether or not to be a politician. In terms of gender ordering, which is the kind of hierarchical valuing of masculine things over feminine things, I mean, we certainly see that to be the case in terms of levels of income, amount of power, amount of autonomy men have in comparison to women. in my political analysis, I like to always ask, what's the problem represented to be? And I think perhaps it's time we moved away from representing the problem as women's underrepresentation in terms of income, and thinking perhaps of the problem in terms of men's overrepresentation. A little bit contentious there. So, for example, I mean, even when you just look at the figures in this way, you think about things quite differently. So, at the moment, 70% of all MPs in Australia are men. 90% of all board positions are held by men. 74% of senior public servants are men. 16 out of 20 cabinet ministers are men. Men earn 67% of all income, and so on and so forth. And when we think about it in this way, in terms of men having to move out of some of these positions or give up some of the resources, I think we think of slightly different strategies. And I kind of joke, you know, instead of having women in leadership courses, we could have men in mediocrity courses. But in reality, I think... Well, I know a few who could lead them. They can move out of positions of great power into run these courses. It's a great redeployment scheme. But no, I mean, I think, well, things, for example, like, you know, changing the nature of occupations, which would enable men to move out of them, enable men to take on more family work, or to not feel they have to be so devoted to these long careers. And I think they're kind of institutional changes that all of my colleagues can give us suggestions on, as well as the kind of cultural changes that need to be put in place around these ideas of choice and equality.
Rebecca?
Sometimes I despair about how far feminism has come. When I sit in the research groups I do and people talk about bad traffic and climate change and they blame working women for that, working mothers. And I despair when I hear, yeah, obesity is a good one. I despair when I hear people describe single women as deliberately barren or talk about women's virginity as a special gift. I then think about hurling something at the screen. But then I also think, so that's where we need to go. Where we've come is still significant. I think about my grandmother who came to this country when she was 9 from Italy, was educated only till 11, was required to be married and have children and had no options. And I think we have made progress. It doesn't mean that we excuse the Neanderthals that decided to some of them in the federal parliament, but it means that we need to reflect on where we've come and use it as strength for the future.
Okay. We'll go back to politics specifically because we've mentioned the First Lady situation in the UK, and we've all watched here, of course, even the US election with the opposites, if you like, Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin. I don't know if they're opposites, but certainly on opposite sides, coming from different places, certainly, to be very prominent in both campaigns. And of course, we've also had Theresa May in Australia playing her role, I suppose, as First Lady. So would you like to speak about the Sarah Palin moment, I suppose, in the UK, in the US, which continues with her book, and where we're at with where Hillary is at, and what happened in that campaign?
Well, it's so tempting just to start with Sarah Palin. So, so let me give two positive mentions first. When the first is to John McCain, that he selected her. That was a bold move and it was a brave move. And kudos to him for doing it. I think he chose the wrong woman, but there were only at the time, I think 3, as there still are now, female Republican governors of states. Few women in the Senate, none of whom could be spared. So the pool from which he had to draw was small, and he didn't draw the strongest fish, but good for him. The second is when Sarah Palin was announced before the convention, but there was a press conference, and I remember being at the American Political Science Association meetings, watching her on TV, surrounded by my horrified colleagues. And she gave a nice little shout out to Hillary Clinton, someone who had gone before. So 2 good things for Sarah Palin. So a couple of things to say about Sarah Palin. I think she's fascinating. And I think she's fascinating because she enacts masculinity in a very feminized and also sexualized form. She is very strong, she's very bold, she speaks out, she uses language of stand up for, stand up against, speak out for. She talks about hunting, she talks about sport, she talks about playing basketball. I forget what her nickname was on the basketball team. It wasn't the Terminator, but it was something very vigorous and fierce. And I think that's part of her attraction and fascination. And in addition, she has a large family, and she appears to be happily married, and she certainly presents herself that way. And I think that allows her to come across both as interesting and reassuring, and also representative of a particular segment in the United States that sees itself now not very well represented. And I just want to say something in regard to what Mary said. I really do see the feminist moment in the United States as being located in an increasing moment of unrecognized class tension. Economic inequalities are now about the levels of the early 1900s. They're very serious. This is due to a variety of things. Real wages have been declining since 1974. We can be happy that women now make on average about 79% of what men make, but men now make so little that it's not the full victory that we might have hoped for. And certainly the Bush tax cuts had a lot to do with redistributing wealth upwards to the top 5%, and in fact concentrated at the top 1/100%. Their income has risen. It's wealth, it's not earned income. And this, I think, positions feminism very differently, and I think it's also given Sarah Palin her moment as some kind of symbolic presence of someone recognizing that something's wrong, being able to say something about it, but not in that particular way.
And is it saying something that's useful? That is it going to help women?
Probably not. But there's something else I just want to say, and then I promise I'll be quiet for a while. Sarah Palin's rise has come at a time when women's representation in the Republican Party has plummeted. There are now fewer women representing the Republican Party in state legislatures than there have been in any time since 1980. There has been a decline in the last 2 congressional elections for the House of Representatives in Republican women elected to the House. Republican women are a distinct minority now, and they always have been, but this is really now something that's quite interesting that I'm sort of paying attention to. So here's Sarah Palin. I won't say she's on the rise. She's now prominent. I give her no chance of public office. We can talk about that later. But it's happening at a time when the Republican Party is literally purging itself of female candidates and elected women.
That's quite a common phenomenon too, is that you can have, for example, in New South Wales, you have a female premier and a female deputy premier, but New South Wales has the lowest percentage of women in Parliament. So that kind of achievement of women masks a broader, I think, bottleneck in terms of women being able to do anything at even just the MP level, regardless of what's happening with women more generally. It's the Oprah effect, very much. That kind of like, we look at the stars and we don't necessarily look at what's happening underneath.
But isn't that happening? That's not specific to one party.
No.
In any of the countries, it would seem to me, when John Howard came in, a lot of women in that. A lot was made of the women that he brought into Parliament, and yet things didn't change for women. There are more women, as you said, in US politics, and yet at a real fundamental level, they are not supported in the ways, unless it pays, as you say. Is that the same in the UK, Fiona, would you say?
Well, you had the famous situation of Margaret Thatcher with no other woman in the cabinet. And although Margaret Thatcher, clearly, a bit like Sarah Palin, there was a symbolic importance to Margaret Thatcher in terms of feminism and role models. And if you like, making it...
There was no other woman.
There was no other woman in the cabinet, no.
And what was the percentage of... Was there an increase in percentage of women in
No.
Victoria? No.
No.